Hello to all of you. My name is Amber Himes Cornell. I'm a fisheries officer at FAO headquarters in Rome. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person to join you for this important workshop, but hopefully this presentation can help you learn more about OECMs in a fisheries context. As you probably already know, area-based conservation of marine resources has been a key focus of many conservation-focused strategies and actions for decades. For centuries, indigenous peoples and local communities have implemented their own area-based management strategies with a perspective of environmental stewardship, sustainable use, and biodiversity conservation. Then, in the last century, governments started focusing on creating marine protected areas to limit human use of special areas. This international shift in focus to area-based management, predominantly through MPAs, ultimately led to a number of area-based targets and goals. The parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity officially recognized the role of area-based management in biodiversity conservation through the adoption of the 2011-2020 Strategic Plan and Aichi biodiversity targets. The Aichi Target 11 called on countries to conserve 10% of the marine environment in conserved areas by 2020. And today we have the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework and the new 30 by 30 target for 30% of the oceans to be conserved. These targets were really the first formal acknowledgement that a wide spectrum of area-based measures other than protected areas can contribute to global conservation initiatives. Through these other effective area-based conservation measures, or OECMs, there is an opening for a wide variety of area-based management measures to count. These targets carry over the same elements of having effective management, providing for in situ conservation, and representative and well-connected systems from previous targets. But they also add a new appreciation and need to recognize and respect the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities. Today, around 8% of the world's ocean has been protected through marine protected areas and OECMs. There's a lot of momentum for identifying OECMs, and with this, we need to carefully consider how OECMs should be recognized and who should be involved in that process. So let's talk about OECMs. Until 2018, there was no consensus on how to define what an OECM is or what criteria should be used to identify them. Because of this, the parties to the convention adopted a decision to help guide countries in identifying qualifying areas. This decision led to a formal definition of OECMs, as well as calling for scientific and technical advice on the matter. So let's look at the adopted definition. This decision defined OECMs as a geographically defined area other than a protected area, which is governed and managed in ways that achieve positive and sustained long-term outcomes for the in situ conservation of biodiversity, with associated ecosystem functions and services, and where applicable, cultural, spiritual, socioeconomic, and other locally relevant values. The decision also provides 13 guiding principles that describe characteristics that OECMs should have, as well as 4 criteria and 10 sub-criteria that area-based management measures should have to be considered OECMs. Each of the 4 criteria has a series of related sub-criteria. Criterion A establishes that the area should not currently be recognized as a protected area. This is a fairly simple criterion that has no supporting sub-criteria. Criterion B says that the area is governed and managed. This criterion is divided into 3 more specific sub-criteria in which it is established that the area must be a geographically defined space, it must have legitimate governance authorities, and it must be managed. Criterion C, perhaps the most important one, is talking about whether the area achieves or is expected to achieve a sustained and effective contribution to the in situ conservation of biodiversity. This criterion has 4 sub-criteria. The area is effective, the contributions are sustained or expected to be sustained over the long term, and conservation must be in situ, and information about the area must be collected. Finally, criterion D looks at whether the area has associated ecosystem functions and services, and cultural, spiritual, socioeconomic, or other locally relevant values. As we start talking about OECMs, I think it's important to talk about what kinds of OECMs are possible in the marine environment. At the end of the day, OECMs are sectoral by their very nature. When we're thinking about fisheries OECMs in particular, we're basically talking about established, spatially defined management and/or conservation measures that are not protected areas, but which are producing positive long-term and in situ biodiversity outcomes in addition to the intended fisheries outcomes. There's a lot of potential for fisheries OECMs, as area-based management is a really common tool used to implement sustainable fisheries management. There are a lot of different types of area-based fisheries management measures, really, but some of the most commonly used ones are fisheries closures, fisheries restricted areas, locally marine managed areas, territorial use rights, and gear bans. To help people get started, FAO has written a handbook on how to identify, evaluate, and report OECMs in marine fisheries. The handbook describes the key characteristics of fisheries OECMs and discusses the benefits of identifying and reporting fisheries OECMs. In addition, it outlines a process to identify, evaluate, and report OECMs specifically in a marine fisheries context. There's a lot more information in the handbook than what I have time for, but let me give you a brief overview of the process. The FAO handbook outlines 4 main phases for identifying, evaluating, and reporting OECMs. The ultimate goal here is really to get the right people in the room with the right information, go through potential sites, evaluate them against the criteria, and then officially recognize them. Here's a more detailed look at the screening steps. You can see all 4 phases here with a set of concrete steps to take in each one. Phase 1 launches the OECM evaluation process by providing a foundation for an equitable, objective, systematic, and transparent process. As such, this phase is used to establish oversight of the process, develop transparent decision-making rules, identify, engage, and involve relevant actors, coordinate how information will be gathered, and obtain consent from relevant rights holders. Importantly, this launching phase really ends with selecting an approach to generating a list of sites to evaluate in the subsequent phases. To begin the initial screening, you need to create a list of potential sites and run the screening on each of them. There are different approaches to take. You may choose to start out with either a group of sites that you would like to consider or just one site that you think has potential to be an OECM. With these sites, you'll go through an initial screening to weed out any sites that do not fully meet the intent of OECMs. This will give you a smaller pool of candidate sites that then move on to phase 3, the full evaluation, which involves a closer scrutiny of the sites to determine which sites meet the criteria. There may be a variety of reasons a site does not pass the initial screening, such as already being recognized as an MPA or lacking clear boundaries. Sites that make it through the initial screening will go on to full evaluation. Here you will undertake a more detailed evaluation of the sites and build on the basic information that was gathered during initial screening. This will then support the OECM selection, recognition, and reporting during the final phase. The full screening focuses on criteria C and D and will entail answering questions in greater depth about management approaches, the effectiveness of management, and related biodiversity conservation outcomes. As such, not all candidate sites that make it through the initial screening will necessarily qualify as OECMs. In addition, full screening should not begin immediately following initial screening. An important and necessary step is to conduct a consultation to inform stakeholders and rights holders of the legitimate authority's interest in evaluating an area as an OECM and to receive feedback and obtain consent where relevant prior to initiating full screening. Once you've gone through the initial screening and full evaluation, you can move on to officially deciding which measures you think meet the criteria. When it comes down to it, at the end of the evaluation process, when a country decides what should be reported as an OECM, the final step is to actually report it. This reporting helps you assess your progress against national and international goals and commitments to the CBD or other global agreements. The main repository for reporting OECMs is to the World Database on OECMs. Reporting can be done by government as well as private entities, indigenous peoples, and local communities. This also includes what we call a strengthening step, circling back from selection to evaluation. It's inevitable that some candidate sites will fall short of meeting all of the criteria. In this case, the evaluation process should help you identify where improvements could be made to strengthen management of those areas so that they can be reported in the future. I'd like to emphasize that you really need to document the entire process as you evaluate potential OECMs. I recommend that you document the pool of sites that you considered and screened, the decisions you made for each site at each step of the process, any evidence that supports those decisions, proof of consent that was obtained from rights holders and communities where relevant, who the governing and managing authorities are, and which rights holders and stakeholders participated in the process. By maintaining records of all of your decisions and the supporting information used to make those decisions, you will be able to easily justify the final OECM decision, generate concrete examples of how you went through the process and your lessons learned, use them to guide additional OECM evaluations you do in the future, and provide other people with examples of how they can do an OECM evaluation process. An important question that I get asked is, do fisheries OECMs already exist? Due to the prevalent use of area-based or spatial fisheries management measures and tools around the world, many of them already meet or are close to meeting the OECM principles and criteria. However, for marine OECMs, so far only Canada, the Philippines, Guernsey, and Colombia have reported them. For those that don't already meet the criteria, they may only need small changes or upgrades in order to satisfy the remaining criteria. Some examples of this might be adding more technical measures or restrictions, improving spatial integration, which involves combining different area-based fisheries management measures from different fisheries to have a greater impact, or increasing monitoring enforcement efforts, or strengthening compliance of conservation measures. For the OECM process, the intention is really not to identify measures that meet the principles and criteria, but also to identify those that could meet them with small feasible changes. As countries begin considering whether they have existing area-based fisheries management measures that could qualify as OECMs, there's a few key considerations to keep in mind. First is that area-based fisheries management measures have three main dimensions of constraint. One is in time, where areas are closed to fishing permanently, temporarily, seasonally, or on a rotational base. In space, where the areas are closed in the high seas, the entire exclusive economic zone, or all or part of a fishing ground. And then the types of fishing activities that are controlled. For example, where limitations may apply to all fishing or only some gears or some socioeconomic categories. The degree of restriction in these three dimensions leads to a large range of measures that, when combined with different potential purposes and contextual parameters, for example, with oceanographic characteristics, jurisdiction, or types of governance, create lots of different possibilities that could be considered here. This illustrates the potential for fisheries OECMs to come from a wide range of area-based fisheries management measures. Now that we've gone quickly through how to evaluate OECMs, let's take a minute to look at the opportunities and benefits of recognizing fisheries OECMs. There are many fisheries area-based management tools that can protect habitats and contribute to biodiversity conservation, which then also contributes to the achievement of global and national goals and commitments. However, two common questions arise when considering the contribution of these tools to global goals and targets. The first question is, what is the added value of recognizing area-based management tools as OECMs beyond achieving global goals? And what is the benefit for other interest groups that are concerned by OECMs? So let's consider the general reasons for why OECM recognition may be beneficial. Well, first, it encourages the continuity of effective management approaches and provides models for other management to strive for. It supports improved coordination between institutions across sectors and across scales of management and governance. The OECM label can emphasize the relevance of biodiversity conservation in sustainable use sectors. It builds complementarity and connectivity with management measures primarily targeted towards conservation objectives, and it increases accounting accuracy under Target 3 of the Global Biodiversity Framework. We know that indigenous and locally led fishery management examples are working. So from the perspective of the global conservation community, it would be really great to count these against these global targets. But how might local fishing communities themselves see the pros and cons of OECM recognition? What potential benefits might they hope to receive, and in turn, what downsides might they be concerned about? From our work, representatives of fishing communities and indigenous groups have expressed both hopes and fears related to recognition of local marine management and stewardship as OECMs. It's important to remember that there are currently few real-world examples of marine OECMs, and none so far have been reported by a local community or indigenous group. This means that the hopes and fears of OECM recognition that I'm going to share on the next couple of slides are hypothetical at this point. So what hopes do communities and community partners seem to have for OECM recognition? Some of the things that we've heard in our OECM capacity building workshops are that OECM recognition has the potential to sustain local leadership and compliance, maintain traditional knowledge systems, define tenure and rights to land and sea for community members, support increased respect and credibility of their stewardship, provide management rights, especially for traditional fishers, facilitate access to conservation-related funding sources, and also give a voice to fishers and fisheries organizations in conservation decision-making. With those hopes comes fears that communities may have regarding OECMs that could dissuade them from wanting to engage in this recognition pathway. We've heard concern that OECM recognition will bring international attention to areas, which could have benefits as outlined in the previous slide, but could also bring unfair scrutiny of local management. There's the potential that local fishery managers may be blamed unfairly for effects of climate cycles beyond their control. There is also the potential that the international conservation community may attempt to influence local management following labeling of areas as OECMs, which could then take away management control from communities. Formalization of traditional management practices may erode traditional knowledge systems rather than help maintain them. Formal recognition could infringe on customary rights. There could be additional time and cost burdens related to resource-intensive aspects of the OECM label, including the identification and reporting process. Since the process comes from outside entities, there's also a fear that OECMs may be another extractive global biodiversity conservation effort. And then, frankly, there's just overall uncertainty that the potential benefits will materialize at all. There are currently not a lot of examples for how these hopes and fears will play out in the real world. We hear these fears and are trying to work on how to support communities so that OECMs are one way that they can have recognition if they choose to pursue it. But this is an evolving conversation. Those in charge of reporting databases, such as the World Database on OECMs, are currently in conversation with diverse stakeholders and rights holders around alternatives for local communities and indigenous peoples to report their areas. It's also important to make sure that your process is built in consent and respect and offer flexibility so that communities can engage in the best ways for them. Here are some things that we can do and keep in mind as an international community and as countries to support inclusiveness of community-led efforts, values, and knowledge, and the potential for them to participate in these international goals if they choose. So first of all is to understand that the OECM process might not be sought out by all communities. We really kind of emphasize that you need to obtain free, prior, and informed consent continuously throughout the process to ensure that rights are respected. Should provide support for local level conservation with empowerment and local participation. Align with local values and traditional knowledge systems. Facilitate knowledge exchange, technical assistance, and replication of best practices in regional and national forums. Foster participation, co-management, and cooperation between sectors, and recognize different governance and management models. And by keeping these things in mind, we can hopefully increase the chances that communities will see the potential and their role in these global conservation discussions. Knowing all of this, I'd like to encourage you to move forward with trying to find area-based fisheries management measures that can be reported as OECMs. As we looked at earlier, the ability for OECMs to both complement the conservation efforts of protected areas and contribute in a novel way mean that OECMs provide an incredible opportunity. OECMs represent an opportunity to recognize areas and stakeholder efforts that contribute to in situ conservation. They also provide an opportunity to contribute jointly to biodiversity conservation goals and the Sustainable Development Goals, and are going to be essential elements in meeting the global biodiversity framework targets. The process of identifying OECMs can enhance dialogue between the conservation and other sectors and enhance mainstreaming of biodiversity. And on that note, no one has all the answers, so it's really important to ask questions and share early experiences so we can all learn from each other. Bringing all of this together, what should you remember about how to apply the OECM criteria? A national process is important to ensure coherence and coordinate sectors. In the marine environment, a regional process under a regional seas convention or a regional fisheries body is really useful as well. It can help catalyze identification of OECMs by countries and enable sharing experiences and feedback from countries on their processes and the challenges that they've encountered. The CBD decision on OECMs highlights that the criteria should be applied in a flexible manner and on a case-by-case basis. Any guidance should help interpret how this flexibility can be applied while maintaining a coherent and certain threshold of the OECM across sectors, a nation, and region. In the marine environment, promoting intersectoral dialogue as well is critical, and OECM should be linked to efforts towards marine spatial planning. OECM processes spark a debate on enhancing effectiveness of MPAs as well, and where we can hopefully have an equal burden of proof for both. And at the end of the day, what I really want to encourage you to do is to keep it practical and to not get bogged down into philosophical debates. Hopefully you now have a deeper understanding of what OECMs are, how fisheries fit into it, what the criteria and principles are, and then a little bit about how to operationalize them in an OECM evaluation and assessment. If you have any questions whatsoever, please feel free to email me at the email address here, and I want to thank you for your attention.